was told that I was going to be asked 3 questions, and I wonder what they are.
All right. Well, I will start out with one that I have. All right, because we've had a panel, we've had an extensive discussion about the question of the present danger and sort of how we got here. There have been many different presentations, different aspects, and particularly our European guest, Professor Dr. Wilfried Schreiber and Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Brassard of Switzerland, Dr. Schreiber from Germany, given real insight into what this looks like from the standpoint of people outside of the United States, which is an extremely important element. I guess I'll just ask you, just to get us started, because we had a video from you we did not show. We wanted to wait to see if we got you. Could you just give, from the vantage point of your experience, because you were there, you were at the time of the fall of the wall and then coming in for the Reagan administration and negotiating that situation, why is it that we have betrayed that understanding, and what has it meant for the world that the United States did not do what you and others attempted to do at that time?
Well, if you're speaking of the pledge not to expand NATO to the east, yes, I would say that my Secretary of State, Mr. Baker, and the German Foreign Minister, the British Prime Minister, they all gave assurances to Gorbachev if he would approve the merger of the 2 German states, that is the merger of the German Democratic Republic into West Germany, that there would be no expansion of NATO. At one point, Secretary Baker actually said, assuming there is no expansion of NATO, not 1 inch, wouldn't it be better to have a united Germany in NATO? And Gorbachev answered, well, obviously any expansion is not permissible, but he went on to say that he could understand the reason we might want to keep NATO, even with a united Germany. Now, when it came to writing the treaties, this was not included in the formal treaties. These were, I would say, diplomatic promises. And I would say this promise was given on the background of a prior statement by President Bush, our first President Bush, who agreed in his meeting with Gorbachev in Malta that if the Soviet Union pledged not to use force in Eastern Europe to prevent political change, that is the democratization, and President Bush pledged that we would not take advantage of the democratization. So the background was pretty clear that Gorbachev felt he had assurances there would be no more expansion of NATO. Now, when the formal agreement was made, there was made an exception for the territory of the former East Germany, in that although it was allowed to be part of NATO, then but there could be no foreign troops or nuclear weapons stationed there, and that was formally in the treaty. So that now, I think that, let me just add that for Russia, the problem has not been so much expansion of NATO. That is, the fact that the United States would, in effect, guarantee the security. What they have been most opposed to, and this was pointed out to us in the 1990s, was the stationing of American or other Western bases in these countries. So that we have to remember that President Putin actually did not object to the initial expansion of NATO. Well, he was not prime minister then, but the additional expansion to the 3 Baltic countries, when that was proposed, actually he was in New York at a meeting of the Council on Foreign Relations, I believe it was, and I asked him directly what he thought about the expansion of NATO into the 3 Baltic states. He said that, well, he thought that was unnecessary, but as long as there were no bases, he had no objection. Now, so the problem has been the combination. And then at the same time, it was very clear that there would be a difference in Moscow's attitude toward NATO, you might say the countries in Eastern Europe and the Baltic states, and those that were former Soviet republics and recognized as Soviet republics by the United States and others. So that the idea of expanding NATO into, say, Georgia, Ukraine, or Belarus would have been a red line, I think, for any Russian president. And I must say that the Russian government did respect the borders that were agreed upon until the question of NATO expansion began, and the attempts by the Western powers, certain ones, to, I would say, to interfere in the politics of Ukraine. This was something that I think anyone who understands the history, which is very complex, of this would understand that that was going to be resisted by the Russians. None of this means that what has happened has been good, or that I would agree that it should have happened. But I think what we need to understand is that the expansion of NATO, and particularly the bases, and in this case, it was the bases that were planned in Poland and I believe Romania for anti-ballistic missiles. It turned out that although these were defensive weapons, the ones used could easily be converted to offensive weapons. So it was understandable that the Russian leader would be quite opposed. And yet we went ahead and after progressively withdrawing from virtually every arms control agreement that we had negotiated in the 1980s and early 90s, then we began to try to influence the Ukrainian government to offer NATO membership. So I think that this was a complete reversal of the diplomacy we used to end the Cold War and to end the nuclear threats to Europe.
Okay, see Helga has a question or a discussion. Please, Helga, go ahead.
Yes, Ambassador Matlock, I know it is difficult, when history takes a wrong pathway, you cannot put it back. But I would nevertheless ask you, what can be done to diffuse this present situation, which is so extraordinarily dangerous? When you said in the interview you gave us earlier that the atmosphere around the end of the Soviet Union was completely different than what people have in memory, that the Cold War did not end with the unification or even the end of the Soviet Union, but actually 2 years earlier. And there were a lot of ideas, including from Prodi, who basically had this idea of a united common house from Lisbon to Vladivostok. This was later picked up by several people, but when Putin mentioned it in the German Bundestag, he already was getting a cold shoulder. But, given the fact that, we are in a situation in Europe right now, there is no relationship between Russia and Germany, Russia and the United States. The trust level is at zero. But somehow we must find a pathway of rebuilding trust. We will be neighbors with Russia for the rest of the planet's existence, unless we move the tectonic plates in a different way. This is just the reality. So what, in your experience, what advice could you give to the present leaders who obviously, would urgently need such advice? What should we do to get the world from the abyss and reconnect some kind of idea that diplomacy is the way to solve conflicts, and maybe even have a vision of how to build a common security and development architecture which takes into account the interest of everybody?
Well, first of all, there are a lot of questions here, but the basic one I have tried to make actually in several books, none of which, by the way, have been published in German. But is that, number one, the Cold War did not end with a Western victory, as it is usually perceived. We negotiated it into the Cold War, which was a victory for everybody. And the end occurred because Gorbachev dropped the ideology which had fueled the Cold War. And he did that involuntarily, and so on. So now the Soviet Union then broke up. The Cold War had ended definitively 2 years before the Soviet Union broke up. The Soviet Union broke up not because of Western pressure and because it was defeated, but because of internal pressures of the nationalism in the various republics, and particularly the leadership of the Russian Federation President Boris Yeltsin. So those who say that Russia is always imperialistic have a very short memories. Actually, Russia led the breakup of the Soviet Union, and the details are there. And I went through them in great detail on a book called Autopsy on an Empire, which I published around 1996. Now the thing is that this gave us the possibility that to develop I would say, a security structure for Europe that would include everybody. That is what Gorbachev expected and what he thought he was promised. The problem was that after, and frankly, I think that if the first President Bush had been reelected, we would have developed that. I know that they had in mind that, but unfortunately, he lost that election. And the successor government seemed to be, although they were not the government that brought the end of the Cold War, to brag about, oh, we are the victors, and in effect, they were defeated. And the expansion of NATO, and then eventually the putting of military bases in Eastern Europe, I think was extremely ill-advised, because actually Russia at that time was in no way threatened any of these countries. But you begin to militarize them in an alliance that excludes Russia. And of course, Russia is going to see this as directed against it. So, all right, now you ask, what can we do now? I am not optimistic that anything can be done in the short run. It may take some catastrophe to bring us to our senses. The problem is, right now, in the United States, both political parties are really supporting what I think is a very dangerous policy. And those of us who want to emphasize peace are really a minority in both of those parties. And unfortunately, the American people are not paying attention to this. In this very active presidential election race, if you ask people what their concerns are, foreign policy maybe ranks about 6th or 7th, and only 4% of our population would put that at the top. In other words, we're fighting over issues which are, I would say, much less important, but that means that actually, politically speaking, it's difficult for either candidate to actually to espouse a coherent policy to turn away from totally from this. So I know that among other things, we're particularly worried about the possibility of the war in Ukraine going nuclear, and and I think that obviously the sort of tensions that are being raised means that, and the fact that the sides seem to have nuclear weapons on, in effect, deployed and sometimes virtually on alert, that this is dangerous because of the ease in which a mistake could be made. I don't think either side right now is going to use them. And the fact is that President Putin has said that they would only use them if the existence of the Russian state came into question. I don't think we're near that point. But raising it, I think what we in the West or our governments ignore is that Russia and some of our other so-called adversaries have capabilities in other areas that match ours, particularly in cyber and in the possibility, for example, of attacking communication satellites, which are essential for many of these weapons. And I think there has been really a great arrogance on the part of the US and its NATO allies about our capability here, because the current policies are really not only dividing the world and inviting more violence, but also are actually strengthening those that we consider our adversaries in many respects. But in any event, in the short run, I don't see the possibility, of a sudden change. It's going to have to be gradual. And I would also say these problems in Europe, the war in Ukraine, we have to remember there's also a war going on in the Middle East. And in fact, that is involving what I think by any definition is genocide. And I am ashamed that that genocide is being carried out by weapons supplied by the United States. If you ask why, I would say because of our domestic politics, because the pressure to do that has been very great. And but that is a big issue. And then when we look at policies in the Far East, the attempt, quote, to contain China and to, in effect, warn that we would defend Taiwan if it should be attacked, raises the possibility of a war there. And again, one with a country with nuclear weapons. And when I look at that as an American, and right now, I think primarily of American interests, I find great dangers. I believe the United States in the obligations we have taken on because defending another country, the guarantee is a liability. That's insurance. It is not an asset. And we are grossly overextended. And the United States has been paying for all these wars since we invaded Iraq, borrowing funds and borrowing largely from other people. We now have debts of over, I think, $33 trillion. And the chairman of our Federal Reserve Bank has said this is unsustainable. But there is no plan being discussed politically that's going to change it, because everything both candidates are saying now, they're going to cut taxes. In other words, they're going to continue these deficits. Pretty soon, that's going to become unsustainable. But it's very hard for me to predict when that will happen. But in as much as in the United States, and I think in some other countries, our most prominent media seem to be simply mouthpieces for those who are following these grossly mistaken policies.
Ambassador Matlock, I'm going to request that President Donald Ramotar ask the final question for you. He, of course, president of Guyana, former president of Guyana. He represents a person that governed a nation, not a superpower, but which represents the vast majority of humanity that often are incorrectly reduced to spectators when it comes to global policymaking discussions and decisions. I thought that since he both ceded this time, which was very good, and he represents that global majority, that you get a chance to pose the last observations. If you have more time to stay with us, great, but I wanted to at least give him the opportunity to address you. We can't hear you. Could you unmute?
You hear me now?
Yes, you're fine.
First of all, I would like to say how happy I am to see Mr. Matlock speaking and so forth. I always admired him. I read a lot of his work. My question to him would be, how much of this, what is happening today, would he put to the whole question of the deterioration of the quality of leadership in the West at this point in time?
Well, obviously, I'm very much disappointed with the decisions have been made. And I think it's going to take probably some, at least minor catastrophes to begin to bring people to their senses. I just hope it's minor and not major. I mean, I think we're seeing enough catastrophes already, but there is still too much attempt I would say, to try to solve problems by using military force or economic compulsion. And these measures tend to backfire. And also, I believe that we are facing real problems for humanity, even aside from, you might say, the threat of nuclear weapons, and the deterioration of the environment, global warming and the changes that will bring, because obviously we are facing now an increasing problem to deal with global warming, which may reach stages which cannot be reserved. And that is going to require or stimulate widespread migrations for economic reasons. We already see the political problems, these migrations, because of war and environmental degradation are bringing about on the political structure of our various countries. So I do think that in the final analysis, I do hope that our political establishment will wake up. And you cannot actually at the same time, seems to me, try to restrain global carbon dioxide emissions while you are dropping 2,000-pound bombs on Gaza. I mean, these wars are obviously counteracting almost anything we're trying to do on global warming. And of course, that is, I would say, one of the greatest dangers facing the next 2 or 3 generations. I will not live to see the results of these, but I really worry about my grandchildren.